podcast, I'll have long conversations with a guest and edit it down to something more manageable. I didn't do that with this episode. Today, I'm joined again by Trish Frempong, author of the Confessions of a Hustling Mama blog, which you can find on Instagram. I wanted to talk to Trish again because in our last conversation, she mentioned something that stuck with me, being called an Oreo growing up. If you've been living under a rock your whole life and you have no idea what an Oreo is, it's a black person who seems to act white, and I put that in quotations. Acting white for so many misguided black teens in particular is about achievement. So if you speak properly, if you do well in school, you're acting white. You're an Oreo. I've experienced this. I immediately understood what Trish was saying, and I wanted to unpack that idea with her that underachievement is somehow tied to blackness for a lot of black children. How sad is that? Initially, our conversation was supposed to focus on education and include another guest, a teacher. He wasn't able to make it, but what ended up happening is that Trish and I, two black women, roughly the same age, with kids about the same age, who've had similar experiences, had a truthful, honest conversation about what it means to be black in a white world, in education, in work, in life. If you listen to only one Woke Mommy Chatter podcast, listen to this one. It's great to talk to you again off the back of our last episode, which was about the terrible threes, the traumatic threes. Yeah. It was interesting to me because you said something in that show that I kind of wanted to maybe talk about a little bit more, which was, you said, when you were growing up, you were called an Oreo, and that was something that kind of was familiar to you. And I thought, oh my God, I kind of have that. No one ever actually called me an Oreo. I don't know if they knew what that was, but I had that same experience of that idea of not being black enough. And and I guess what I wanted to unpack about it is I feel like sometimes that's tied to achievement. Yeah, and it's definitely. And it's the most bizarre thing to me around, why it is that, if you're black and you're doing well in school and you're trying and you're there's this kind of idea that you are trying to be white. Achievement is tied to being white. Yes. And it's such a strange thing, but I guess we'll start. If you tell me your story, so what was it like for you growing up, and how did that kind of word and experience kind of enter your life?
Okay, so I'll start by saying my first few years of living were in Toronto, and I grew up Seventh-day Adventist, and the church and school I went to up until maybe grade 1 or 2 was 99% black population. So there was, or maybe the school was 80% black and a large number of people of color and very few white children and educators, as far as I can recall, at school and at church. It was pretty much all black. And so what happened in about grade 1, 2, I moved to Brampton, which is the burbs, and at the time I was maybe one of 2 black kids. I didn't really notice any on the playground. That shifted with time and immigration and people just moving from city to city, from country to country. But what happened is, growing up here when I was in Toronto, I didn't really have a sense of, much like my story with my daughter, I didn't really have a sense of I am black. But once I moved to Brampton and felt like just an actual cultural shift and a demographic shift, I knew I was different, but it wasn't as if it was a problem. And I feel like it was by the time I got to grade 5 that I realized, because of my church background, my upbringing. I didn't feel like I fit in with other Black students. And, our musical interests were different. What we watched on TV was different. What we did after school was different. And I remember it was a Black student who had identified me as an Oreo cookie. And, as much as I didn't fully understand how ridiculously inappropriate and racist, and that, what's the word I want to use? Like, way of identifying a person, I didn't understand, didn't grasp what that meant. It still troubled me because I felt like who I was being challenged, but then at the same time, because I didn't really connect with a lot of the Black students in my class, I thought, well, I guess maybe I guess that was kind of my reaction. And then it's interesting because that word or variations of that word followed me all the way through to adulthood. I mean, 5 years ago, a coworker called me a bounty bar, which is pretty much the exact same thing.
Oh my God. Were they Black or white?
This person was a person of color. I think she's East Indian. I don't exactly remember her background, but she was brown. And that, again, felt really troublesome to me. And I didn't have the confidence to fight back or make a comment back, not even fight, but just to respond to that because it was my place of work. And I always am aware of, in my place of work, that I'm almost always the one or two Black person in the space. And so it makes me feel like I have to be small in a way because of the stereotypes and the assumptions and just feeling othered already.
Yeah.
But one thing that you said earlier, thinking about the education, the academic, it was interesting because a classmate of mine, the one who called me an Oreo cookie, or the first one to call me an Oreo cookie, I remember that she and I used to struggle a lot in class because I was pretty well a well-educated, smart, active student. And she was really smart as well, but she would downplay how smart she was. And I wonder now, looking back, if part of the struggle was that she wasn't comfortable actually being okay with answering the questions in class and showing that she was smart. And it actually was a big shift within my own education because I started to play down how smart I was in class and put in less effort. And I don't think I would have pieced that together until now or even recently without that little caveat you shared at the beginning of the show.
Yeah. It's funny. You and I, our experiences are very similar. And it's what's interesting though is I grew up in Toronto. Well, what is now Toronto? I grew up in North York in Jane and Finch. And whenever I tell people that, they always just think Black. And that's not really what the Jane Finch corridor is. It's very diverse. And in my school, I was a minority. My school was like going to elementary school. It was almost like 95% Italian. Yeah. And I was always like the only Black kid in class until, until the kind of the demographics started to shift a little bit. And even then it was just like there was one other Black kid. It wasn't like, half the class was Black. There was one other Black kid. So I was always kind of other than that way. And my high school was the same thing. And then at high school, there were a few more Black kids, but they all hung around together. So they were all together, and then there was me. And I had my group of friends, and no one ever explicitly called me an Oreo, but there was that feeling, right? That I wasn't Black enough, that I was trying to be white, or I was acting white.
Yeah, and I used to fake that I understood reggae songs as a kid.
Yeah.
If you didn't know
or patois. Yeah.
You had a problem.
Oh my God.
Were the issue.
That's so true. And now, so I love, like, now that I'm an adult, because I can be like, well, I don't understand patois. Like, I don't understand. My parents are not from Jamaica. I can, I can say that now, but you're right. Like, I did the exact same thing.
I faked it. Like, I faked half of these songs that these kids were listening to. I didn't understand the dance moves. And it wasn't because I wasn't interested. It's just, I just grew up differently. And instead of, like, we do it now as adults. So maybe we're better off in a way. It's in terms of having access to the internet and social media, that we understand that we are different. But as a kid, it was so narrow in viewpoint of what it meant to be Black that because I knew I didn't fit, I struggled really hard with trying to fake it so that it wasn't as obvious. But it really took a toll on my self-confidence. It took a toll on how I showed up in the world. It really had just a major impact in the way that I just related to people. And I was also experiencing bullying as a child as well, in part because of not fitting in, because of how I guess showed up in the world, but just differences, and kids are not always kind. But it really had a major impact in terms of creating walls between myself and other people, because I just didn't know any other way to cope.
Do you think that, I think what's also interesting about this conversation is, I don't know how old you are, and I'm not going to ask you, but I am like in my mid-30s. I'll just say that. And that's being generous. And so I'm talking about like growing up, well, I don't know, like early 90s, kind of late 90s in high school, right?
Yeah.
But the thing is, that's a long time ago, and not that much has changed. So there's this guy, his name is, I can't remember his name, but he did a document, Anthony McClellan, I think. He did a documentary called Color Me. If you haven't seen it, you should watch it. Okay. And he did it he went to Brampton, and he's also kind of like this like motivational speaker. He does a lot of work with young people. And he went to Brampton, and basically he wanted to find out why these kids who live in the suburbs they're not achieving. These Black kids who live in the suburbs are not achieving, they're dropping out of school. They're clinging to this kind of culture that's really not their it's not their story, but they're clinging to this kind of underachieving, like, I don't know, like just this culture that isn't them. And he went and he did this interview with these kids, and it was really just really interesting to hear what they had to say. And they sat in a circle and they kind of talked to each other, all these Black kids, and some were saying, well, you're like, I'm dark skinned, and I have, people just make these assumptions about me, and I relate to, this kind of lifestyle more, and he was saying to them, like, you guys are all really smart, and why is it? Like, what does it say when you're not doing well in school? Like, when you're not trying at all? Like, what does that say about, like, who you are? And really trying to get through to them. It was really interesting just to kind of see that. And I feel like really nothing has changed.
No, I agree. I think we're probably of the same-ish age. I will say I'm in my late 30s. And growing up, especially because I was there for a large population growth in Brampton, because I also grew up in Jane and Finch, but I went to a private school. And then when I went to Brampton and I saw the population change, a lot of these kids who, like, as the Black population grew in Brampton, I called them suburban thugs, because they were behaving as if there was a hood, as if there were projects in Brampton. And I know part of it is what they decided and what was being promoted on, like, TV and music videos and music and magazines as being the cool Black experience. Which, that's a whole other podcast and a story in and of itself, in terms of why is that the predominant message that's put out there about Blackness, when we know that is just one narrative of many within the African diaspora. But then you also feed into the culture within the academic system, I think anyways, that already is racist in its tone, anti-Black in its tone, and in action. And so you have teachers who will perpetuate that. So if kids come across, I think anyways, as too cool for school, for lack of a better phrase, teachers aren't, there's no motivation or interest to challenge that or to speak to kids in a way that they will get it. And then when you don't have educators who look like you, who can even relate to you, or even attempt to if they don't even look like you, it's almost like you lose a bit of your opportunity for rapport building. Oh. So it's kind of like this messy, self-perpetuating cycle.
Yeah. I agree.
That is just all over the place.
Yeah, I agree 100% with everything you just said. You're spot on. And there was some work that's being done in Peel, in Brampton, Mississauga right now, around improving or trying to better the outcomes for Black boys. And I think it's called We Rise Up, something like that, or We Will Rise. And it's the school board who's doing this work in conjunction with York University, a researcher there. Okay. And everything you just described, they found in their research. So Black kids are saying, the teachers don't push, they don't expect anything from me. They don't expect me to do well. They don't ever recognize me or push me to do anything but sports. Yeah. They talk about just not feeling part of the school, not feeling welcome in the school, not feeling like their experiences are validated in school. And they're trying to correct that, but it's a system issue. It is. And you're right when you say that the system. I had this conversation with my son's teacher, and it was like just this kind of weird conversation because I think she had no idea what I'm talking about. Where I was trying to explain to her, like I actually said to her, I said like my children are not safe in this school. They're the only Black kids. They are not safe, and I don't mean physically. I mean just emotionally and mentally. I mean if they make it out in one piece, just without their spirit broken, and not mentally fragile, I will be ecstatic. But they're not safe in that environment because the system was not created for them. And there's God, I can't remember his name. He's, I think, the assistant director, something like that, of the Anti-Racism Directorate for Ontario. And I was at a conference and I heard him speak, and he said he had done a bunch of research for his PhD on the number of murders or Black men who'd been killed, something like that, in Toronto for 10 years, so between like 2007 and 2017. And he said that most of the violent crimes, almost 70% were Black men. And then he said when you actually started looking at it, he's like, a lot of these, they were young kids, and they were coming from like areas like Thornhill and Richmond Hill. And he's like, and so he said, what's happening to kind of like draw these kids into this life? Like, what's happening there? Why are they so disaffected within their school? Yeah. And it starts early. Like, there's studies that say that kids as young as grade 1, grade 2, Black kids, are just, they're disaffected. They lose that interest, all that like enthusiasm and that natural ability that they have to learn, they lose because the system is not designed for them. They're not seeing curriculum that speaks to them. The teachers don't look like them. It's It's so...
And it's slow decline, I think. Like, it's not as if all of a sudden in grade 2, it is a completely different world and a completely different impact and experience. It starts with, like, the way the curriculum is taught, what's in the curriculum. You've got burnt out teachers who are struggling on their own, dealing with their own stuff within their personal lives and in the system. Then you've got who's being hired. Do you have educators who even actually care? You've got the administrators, you've got and then you've got just our own personal home lives and how we are navigating our Blackness, and especially in a system where, I mean, at least in the GTA, it's hard to not have both parents, if you're fortunate to have both parents working. So then you have parents coming home who are tired and they can't necessarily, they're so spread thin. Like, everybody is so spread thin, and then who usually ends up at the bottom of the rung in situations like that? So it's, but it still fascinates me how, despite like research that you're hearing about and educators who are trying to do the work, that yet we are still here having to have this conversation. And still having to worry about our children as if we were in the 80s and the 90s. Like, to me, that is wild.
It is. And I'm actually I'm gonna try and post some a few documentaries, because I went to this. It was called the Ontario Education Research Symposium, and it was so interesting, and it was all about equity. And they were taught. They showed this documentary from Nova Scotia from the 90s. And Trish, I mean, everything was the same. Nothing had changed. Nothing. Everything these kids are talking about is stuff. I want to say, like, it's crap that is still happening today, right? And you're 100% right. Like, we know it. We know this.
Yeah.
But...
And so I struggle thinking about my own experience. I struggle with knowing experiences like yourself, or even those who are very different, because, you know, we have friends who probably weren't even born in Canada, came here and have their own sense of questioning of identity, whether it's from within or by others. And how do we actually make a difference with our children, knowing that the system is happening, the cycle is happening, and we're basically willingly, or even if it's not willingly, like, we almost have no choice because of the way society is set up and we got to work, sending our kids out to potentially experience variations of what we did. And that's where I'm at in my life, with trying to figure out what can I actually do, because conversations are great because it helps people, but I feel like my hands are tied because I still don't know the how to fix it.
Yeah, and I don't know what the answer is to that question, right? Like, sometimes I think I can't fix it for anyone else, but I can try and fix it for my kids. And what does that look like for my kids? So honest to God, I flip. Like, so sometimes I'm like, I'm going to quit my job. I'm going to stay home. I'm going to homeschool them. And then other times I'm like, I can't do that. And yeah, you know, this school's okay. Like, they've had great teachers. So it's not, it's not like we're having these problems, but it's these, like, microaggressions and just things that kind of pile on. And I think, well, it would be easier. It would be more affirming for them. Like, my son's school, I don't know if they did anything for Black History Month, but they sure as hell did a lot of stuff for Bonhomme, or for like the French Carnival. And yes, it's a French immersion school, but come on, like, what's the chance, like, as these kids get older, what is going to have the greatest impact in their life? Is it, you know, do they need to know more, or be more aware? Not even, like, I don't think they should be doing lessons on slavery or anything, but do they maybe need to have a better understanding of how Black people have contributed to building Canada? Or should they just be celebrating Bonhomme? I mean, really?
Yeah.
Things like that, right? Like, what books are my kids looking at when they go into the library? And my daughter brings home these, like, books with these little blonde kids all the time.
Yeah.
Like, you know,
the thing is that this information is not even easily accessible for us as parents to then have the information at home to continue to empower. Like, we have to spend hours going online looking for blogs or for recommended books, or you have to spend the extra $20 for shipping for a book that really should just be in the school for all kids to have access to.
And
it's wild like that.
Yeah, and I think actually when you talk about how do we shift this, I think a big part of shifting it is shifting the narrative away from this is for Black kids. This is for all kids. So all kids should know Black history. All kids should be taught by a Black teacher. All kids should have those experiences, right? It's not just about Black children. It's something that benefits all kids. And maybe that's part of it. So, but one of the other things I wanted to touch on, which you mentioned, is you said you have, like, of course, like we have friends who may have come from other countries, and how do you, I guess if someone was coming into this discussion, you know, you and I we've have a similar experience. We are both Black moms. Like we understand without having to really kind of go deep, or there's just this kind of inherent understanding in what we're talking about. But someone who is coming into this cold, they might say, well, what is wrong with Black people? Because, you know, there are people who come here not even speaking English, or there are people who come here from war-torn countries, and they manage to do okay and get through the school system. So I guess if someone said that, like, what would your response be?
Oh, I would say, like anything else, that it's easy to say that when you're coming from the outside in. I think that Black people across the globe have their own versions of how racism has shown up, or maybe not has shown up, especially if you grew up in a city or a country that was largely populated with Black people. But that doesn't mean on a global, international, political scale that they aren't facing racism. They just don't see it on the home front within their houses with their families. And I think the sad uniqueness about North America is that just because slavery officially ended in 1860 whatever, you know, the trickle effect of slavery lasted far longer. And that is a lot of educating, like 400 years of educating, I mean, I use that word quite loosely, a population of people and how they're going to show up in this world and how the world is going to respond to them. And then that continued, like, we definitely know it continued into the 60s and the 70s. So why would we automatically think in 2018 that, oh, it's just because we have no drive? Oh, it's just because we're lazy? I mean, it's not to put the blame all on white supremacy and to say that we don't have to try to dig deeper in some aspects and find new avenues, shift our thinking, reorient to the world or into our communities in a different way. But we can't do that without acknowledging that our history isn't like a 400-year-old history. This is a history of yesterday. And that has an impact. And forget about looking at the history. Just look at what is right in front of you. Look at what messages are being shown on the TV, or the backlash when we try to shift the narrative. Like, just look at Black Panther and how many people are irritated that Black people are so excited by Black Panther wanting to wear kente cloth and African symbology and makeup and stuff to represent when they go watch the movies, but yet they ignore the fact that people, white folks and otherwise, are doing it for Star Wars and Harry Potter, you know, like,
and yeah,
deeper look.
And the uniqueness of the Black experience is that it's twofold. So we get it from Black people too. So there are Black people, and that's part of our history, in the sense of, like, we've been so colonized, right? In this kind of division within the Black community. So you'll hear things like that. You'll hear those kind of white supremacy narratives being repeated by the Black community because we're so broken. And so there's that piece. And then on top of that, I mean, if we get real, there is a hierarchy to racism, and Black people are like right on the bottom, and that's where anti-Black racism is so unique, because we get those kind of racist reinforcements not just from white people. I mean, a lot of times it's coming from, you know, Indian communities or Asian or, you know, other communities. So and that's all piled on us, and our kids get it in school. I remember talking to one mom who said her kids, the kids teacher was East Indian, and there was a discussion in the class around why some kids were like, some Black people were more fair and some were darker, and the teacher actually said that, well, God punished some people are darker because God punished them because they're bad. So if you're dark, that means that God punished you because you were bad, and that's why you're that color.
In 2018?
In 2018. Well, last year, 2017.
Oh, God. That's awful.
Right? And that's a school. That's a local school around in the GTA. So,
wow.
Yeah. So this stuff comes in all directions for Black people. And the other aspect is that a lot of the communities, yes, you've come from a war-torn country, and yes, you may not be able to speak your language, but at least you have a language, right?
And that's it.
At least you have a culture that unifies you.
Yeah.
You have your people. You have that support from your community. We don't necessarily have that.
No, we definitely don't have that. That is like, and especially because it's not as if they just took everybody who lived in one particular neighborhood in West Africa. They took from the coast of West Africa, mainly around Ghana, Nigeria, and whatnot. But that's hundreds of tribes. And then they brought us, shifted us, moved us around, never let us get like any kind of stability with our name, with our identity, with our families. Like, it took away our religion, shamed us for a lot of the things that we are. Like, to heal from that isn't going to happen overnight.
No. And that shame, it's still around. So, I heard someone say they were doing like a traditional kind of African libations, like pouring libations.
Yes.
And someone was saying, like, you know, a lot of people don't like this, and there's a lot of shame when we do this, and it's because and it goes back to that, like, that whole, but this is like part of who we are, like, this is our history, but we don't embrace it because it's like it's different, it's oh my God, like it's tribal, right? Like there's this negative connotation to anything that's African, I guess I'd say, or like just kind of deep tied to our roots. That a lot of people,
it's been a good number of that they've hit us from every single angle, from our spirituality to our physicality to our bodies, our sexuality, our mental health, our homes, our money. Like, we don't have a stable foundation that we are bouncing off of. We are literally creating our foundation as we go. And doing that within a system that isn't here for us. You know, and then to, even when you try to exert who you are, you're met with, you know, the assumptions about you're an Oreo cookie, or you're a Bounty bar, or you're not Black enough, or you talk white. And so even that exerts itself in ways to suggest that who you are isn't good enough, or you talk ghetto, as in to suggest that there's one particular way is the best way to speak or show up in the world, which then further alienates you from not just yourself, but also your community as well.
Yeah. How do you touched on mental health, and that's one of the things I think about a lot. Because I know growing up for me, it was really hard. And a lot of that came from feeling a bit isolated.
Yeah.
And, you know, my parents, they battled, like they really did, battled the school system like every step of the way. And they didn't necessarily like shield me from that. Like, we talked about it openly. But I wonder, sometimes I look at my kids and I wonder what they're meant, like, are they going to be able to make it out of the school system intact with, and I don't know, like, what do you think about, I guess what I'm saying in a really kind of roundabout way is nobody really, I think we need to look at racism and its impact as a mental health issue. And I feel for a lot of the Black kids, and maybe what we're seeing in terms of dropout rates and acting out, so and getting suspended, those kind of things. I feel like a lot of that it's a mental health issue because they feel so marginalized, right?
Yeah.
And I don't think that's being addressed at all. Yeah.
Well, in terms of what you're kind of touching on in a way, in terms of my own kids, and you said this before, that at least I think you did, so correct me if I'm wrong, that you can't necessarily fix the system outright, but you're going to start with your kids.
Yeah.
And so I feel like my hope is that I'm going to use the experiences of myself and other people that I've learned from, or not even just my experiences, but what I can gather in terms of information from all type of sources and resources, and use that as a way to empower my kids. Because the reality is that things are going to be a struggle just for being alive. And we have the extra element of our identity as being Black as well, to manage and work through. So I just hope that at the very least, I'm going to help my kids with the ability to be equipped that when things are hard, that they have tools and resources to work through it. And if they don't have the tools or resources, that they at least know that they have a trusted person in myself that will be there for them to work through it when it happens. Because, I feel if enough of us are doing things at the home front and encouraging our kids to be game changers, maybe we won't see it in our lifetime. Maybe our grandchildren, if we have grandchildren, will see it. But I have a glimmer of hope because I never thought I'd be alive to see a Black president in the United States. And I don't know what the heck happened and aligned to make that possible. Especially with Trump in power now, I'm really not sure what happened to make Obama be in power.
Yeah. All the stars were in the right, alignment. Yeah, I love that you said, there is there is hope. I think what's hopeful is, we're talking about it. People are recognizing it and trying to make changes. And I mean, I don't know. I think, I think what you said about, equipping your kids with resources, for sure. Yeah.
And acting like it's not, and not pretending that it's a thing. Like, we have to acknowledge it's a thing. It makes me sad when I watch on Facebook videos of parents having to talk to their kids about driving while Black, or having to prepare themselves when a police officer stops them, like how to handle that. But I feel like that's a reality that we have to negotiate. Like, we can't pretend that that's not real. And Canada may be different than the States, that may be different from being in the UK, but we still have to do our job to let our kids know what the reality is, because I think if we don't, we are doing them a disservice. How much we tell them and the way that we tell them is very different to our child, but I think it's important that our kids don't go into the world with totally rose-colored glasses, which, when reality hits in, can have an impact on their mental health.
Yeah. Oh my God, yeah. I guess if we switch gears a little bit, because you're right, like, they're going to leave education and they're going to go into the world, and they're going to be in a similar situation. Like you touched on at the beginning, being the only Black employee or the only Black person on your team. And I've been in that situation, and I will tell you, I remember, I don't know, about a month ago, I had two friends, just randomly, they don't even know each other. And I literally, one night I was driving home, and I got a call from one of them, and she was really upset, crying, because she was working really hard on a project and had made a small mistake, something that other people had done, and it became like a huge issue, and that file was taken away from her and given to a girl with less experience. And so my friend is literally the only Black person in the company, like the entire, and this is a global company. Mm-hmm. And so she was experiencing like anti-Black racism, and I think for the first time, and she was, or at least so overtly for the first time, and she was shocked because she's like, I don't understand, like this girl has no experience, how can, it's a small mistake, like it's not, but it was such a shock for her. And she was having a hard time. And then I got off the phone with her, and literally 5 minutes later, another friend called me with a similar situation where, like, she was being basically pushed out of her job. But again, like, only Black person. And it's that same kind of story of feeling isolated and feeling marginalized, and you can't speak up. And so I guess, I don't know, I feel like I've been lucky in the sense that all of my experiences in work, yes, I may have been in the minority, but for the most part, like there were issues, but for the most part, I've never had real issues like that to deal with. Also, I think maybe because I worked in the public sector and it's maybe a little bit more, people are more liberal minded, but I don't know, can you talk a little bit about maybe your experiences?
Yeah. Oh my goodness, I have so many. So I remember once I was working out in Alberta, and I was called colored on the job, like colored. Oh my God. And it was 2006, and I turned around and looked at this woman, and I was like, it's not the 50s. I'm not sure why that's what language you wish to use. And everybody stopped and stared and looked at me because it was like one of the few times that I stood up for myself, because I was so irritated. Like, how in the 2000s is that how you're referencing people? So there was that. And more recently, up until recently, I should say I'm transitioning out of teaching yoga and managing yoga studios. And I remember once struggling because at a yoga studio, the clientele who would come in, and I was managing at the time, would ask questions that only I could answer. And I would answer their questions, but they would automatically redirect all their attention and questions to the white person beside me, who would then look to me to answer. And no matter that weird triangle of engagement, they would never acknowledge my presence. And I remember it took me about 6 months to tell someone higher up than myself a matter of what was going on. And their response was, use your Blackness as your marketing tool. Like, that's your gimmick. And
what?
What
does that even mean?
It's like almost like, oh, you're the teacher with all the tattoos, play that up. You're the teacher who does really cool music playlists, like play that up, like let that be the thing that people come to you for. I felt like that's what they were saying, and it was just like really interesting how people navigated my Blackness. And then when I challenged, like being the only Black person in the space, how they would feel about that. And it was interesting because, I've been in this community for quite some time, but I wouldn't even play, because I teach a lot of classes with music, I wouldn't even play Black artists because I was so uncomfortable with what that would be perceived as. Mind you, I would take other classes with white teachers and East Indian teachers, and they would play hip hop and reggae and all sorts of stuff, and I couldn't bring myself to do it because I just didn't want to be perceived as the Black girl who played Black music. Now it's different. I feel like, especially with the last 2-3 years and the unfortunate circumstances in the States, and my being more comfortable with being Black and talking about it and pushing back, the culture at where I'm teaching and working has shifted a lot, that they've apologized for some of the crap that they've said to me over the years and acknowledged was problematic, but it was hard for a long time to be in a place that you love the work that you do, but you didn't still feel safe.
That story, those stories made me think of something you said earlier, which was as a black person, as a black woman, as a black girl growing up, making yourself small in a space.
Yeah. I did that real well.
And I did too. It's still really hard for me. Like, I'm full of opinions. And I think that's why I like the blog, because I can just I can say what I think, right? Uninhibited. But it's hard for me, and I'm getting better now, but it was hard for me to be in a room as the only black person or one of a few and really kind of speak up and speak fully, you know, in a work environment. And I always found that really difficult. And it's really a hard cycle to break, because even as you're growing up, like I know when I was growing up, part of my parents teaching me to survive and navigate the world was making yourself smaller. And it wasn't that they did that intentionally. It was
respectability politics.
It was respectability. Yeah, you're right. And I'll tell you, we've shifted because we did that initially with our son. I remember especially playing soccer, because he was always, when he was quite little, he was bigger than the other kids. He was taller, and they always looked so small and like helpless. So we were always we ingrained in him, like, you know, we just held him back, basically. Which is really interesting now, because he won't go for the ball. And it's like, go, go, go. But he won't, because we held him back. But I try not to do that with my daughter. And I try to allow her to be who she is and to speak her truth and to, you know, to feel free to speak for herself. And I really do. And she's a handful. But I try not to curb that for her, because I don't want her to grow up like that, to kind of hide herself or to feel like she has to make herself small to fit into, you know, a white space or a predominantly white world. I don't want her to do that. And it's really sad. I think, you know, that description that you had where you're not playing certain music, and I get it. Like, I totally understand. I get it. But it's, how sad is that?
It is, because it's not even a matter of I should play that music or I shouldn't play that music. It was the subtleties of microaggressions that are, I won't swear on your podcast, but how they mess with your head, that you don't even know when is okay, or when you're imagining something, or when you are really experiencing what you're experiencing, and when it's just safer to just err on the side of caution and deal with it on the sidelines than to face the mental and emotional pushback, knowing that most of the time when you have that mental emotional pushback, the person on the other side or the thing on the other side is going to act like it's all in your head anyways.
Yes.
And I go through the drama.
And that's the thing, like that is exactly what worries me so much about my kids in the education system. It's that, because you can never, the experience of racism it's not like it was in the 50s, for example, where it is very subtle now. Right? It's very subtle. So as an adult, maybe there are things that you pick up on, but even as an adult, you just explain, you don't always know, right? You know, you don't always know. So, and that messes with you, and it's exhausting and it's tiring, right?
It's so exhausting, because it's never, you don't just get to, well, I remember once, hopefully I'm not taking up too much space with the story, but I studied psychotherapy as a post-bachelorette degree, or diploma rather, and I remember in one of the sessions, we were doing this particular activity called play therapy, and there was 5 of us, I think, in the group, and everybody else got a doll or a character that looked like them, white, presenting, white looking characters. And when I went to look for something that was black, the woman gave me two options: an angry gorilla,
Oh my God,
K-pop, or a sexy black cat. And I was just like, excuse me, do you have anything that is more reflective of me? And considering that I was in a psychotherapy program, you would have thought that that would have been something that's on their mind in terms of representation and people and who comes into their practice and who comes to be educated by this particular program. And she just looked at me and was just like, oh, well, all of my other colored clients and students don't have an issue. And I was so upset. And I mean, that became one of those like pivotal points in my life where I just no longer was going to stay as quiet and as small as I was when it came to not just my blackness, but just me as a person. And I mean, that there's work and struggle around that, because, you know, you don't just always automatically switch one day and go full tilt in the other direction. But I remember, like, my therapist, because it's part of the program, you have to do that. I tried to explain to her the impact of that, and the entire hour session was countless examples of how from the moment I wake up to the moment I go to bed, I am reminded that I'm black, and I don't even have to go looking for it. Like, I literally wake up and it's like, oh, it's not on my TV. There's no representation of me. I go out into the street in my neighborhood. There's no representation of me, you know? And it's just so hard to try to actively, consciously go up against that as an adult in a world that is trying to tell you that you don't matter. So the work that we're doing as parents for our children, we're on an uphill battle. I still think it's possible, but we're on an uphill battle knowing that people just don't get it and don't have a reason to be motivated to get it.
No. Your story reminded me of something someone told me where there was a child in therapy, black kid, and the black kid was saying to this therapist, you know, I hate being black. And this is a child in the child welfare system. So the government is their guardian. It's like, I hate being black. You know, my skin's so dark and I really don't like it. And the therapist went out and with the child and bought him bleaching cream.
No.
Yeah. You know, so it's everywhere. It's everything you touch, every resource we need, everything is just, there's this level of, it is not designed for us. They are not thinking of our experience.
They're not.
Yeah.
They're not. And it's a constant, we're constantly reminded of that. And I still think that despite how almost depressing that realization is, it's like, we can't give up. Like,
no,
we're not in a position to give up no matter how much we want to.
What's giving up? So do you think, I guess, so in addition to my moments where I'm like, I'm going to quit my job and homeschool my kids, the other thing I do is go on Google and start researching black schools in Ontario, of which there are none. Or I think there's one.
School, but there's one.
Right. So is that giving up, do you think? Like, just pulling out of the system?
So there's two ways that I usually go when I feel like giving up. I will vent to my partner or my mom and say, I want rich white people problems. That's usually where I go first, where I just don't want to deal with anything. I want to be able to be oblivious without a conscience, and I don't mean that in a disrespectful way to people who are rich and white. It's not something they have to navigate, so there's no motivation to figure out how to navigate it. I want that sometimes. The other thing I do, and I mean it's usually in line with my dislike for winter, is I start looking for other countries.
I've done that. We've done that too.
Like, I'm like, what's happening in St. Vincent? What's happening in Turks and Caicos? What's happening in Costa Rica?
Oh my God.
What's happening in Australia and New Zealand? Like, I'm looking, I mean, obviously they're all warm places, but I'm always looking for what else is happening in this world, because somewhere it has to be better or easier. Like, I just constantly, that's my way of giving up, because the truth is I'll never homeschool. I love my children too much to subject them to me in that regard.
Yeah. I know I will never do it, but it's one of those like fantasy kind of things. Yeah.
Yeah. I know my parents, what they did, and it was in part just because of shifting of the times and the goals that my parents had, but that was partly why we moved when we were living in one neighborhood in Brampton to another, was because my parents wanted to foster a different environment for us. And I mean, it's not that we were in a bad neighborhood in any way, shape, or form, but it was realizing the impact of the school that we were in, realizing the impact of the friends that we were surrounded by. And my grandmother did that in the 80s, where she picked up and left, I think they were down in Cabbagetown at the time, and they picked up and moved to Pickering because that's what made sense in terms of creating a better environment for my I guess my aunts and uncles at the time. But yeah, my giving up is literally pretending that I can create a whole different world that will not be subjected to white supremacy, which is not realistic.
No. But we're hopeful.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. Until my last breath, I'm gonna keep at it. And if nothing else, if I have created children who are critical thinkers and engage with the world in a way that doesn't let themselves be small, and maybe they don't change the system completely, but if they themselves are embodied beings who are comfortable in their own skin, then I feel like I've done something.
If you enjoy listening to the show, be sure to subscribe so you get automatic updates of new episodes every Tuesday. Don't forget to follow Woke Mommy Chatter on Twitter at Woke Mommy, on Instagram, and follow along on Facebook at Woke Mommy Chatter. If you'd like to get in touch, have feedback, ideas for the show, drop me a line at wokemommychatter@gmail.com.